Okay, so thanks everyone. So my name is David Mytton, and I'm the founder of Server Density. So if you don't want to set up all your own monitoring, then we can help you with that. We monitor from different locations around the world, we get into the internals of your servers, and we can help you search your logs. And we're processing around 200 terabytes of data each month, running a couple hundred servers across multiple data centers in the US. And I'm going to be going through how to handle on-call operations management. And if you want to follow along, you can get the slides online now. I've just tweeted out the link, so if you want to follow those, you can get them online. And I'm going to start by talking about downtime. So if you were using Google Apps last week, you may have had some problems with Gmail. This outage on their storage product on the cloud was caused by a fiber cut of 2 of their fibers in one data center. And they lost over a terabit of capacity, and inconveniently at the same time on their third link they were running maintenance, which caused downtime to the entire data center. And their spend on infrastructure last year was around $5 billion. This is the postmortem from AWS after Hurricane Sandy, where they had issues in one of their data centers, and last year they spent around $6 billion in infrastructure. And Microsoft Azure has similar outages, and last year they spent around $4 billion in infrastructure. So my question is, how much are you spending on your infrastructure? And are you expecting downtime? Because if these 3 major cloud providers are spending billions of dollars a quarter, and they're suffering downtime, not just on internal components, on their public cloud, and also on their consumer products like Gmail or Outlook, then how can you expect to have 100% uptime? Essentially, it's impossible. And so that's what this talk is about. It's about preparing for that downtime, because it's going to happen. It's impossible to design 100% uptime systems. You can do a lot to avoid trivial failures, but it's impossible to get that 100%. And so you really need to plan to understand how to deal with that. And the goal is that you'll get a tweet like this after an outage we had a couple of weeks ago, when our data center had a fiber cut, and we were down for about a minute. Ultimately, when you write your postmortem, you want to get users saying, thanks for the information. Ultimately, they're not annoyed by that, and you can help your users to understand what was going on behind the scenes, and to make sure your preparations actually come into play. And so the key thing there is preparation. And the first step of this is determining how you're going to do on-call. The way we handle on-call is we have a primary who is always on-call. It's one person in the team, and we rotate through this, but this one person is going to receive any critical alerts out of hours. And we have a secondary. We have a second person, because you can't just rely on a single person. So if that person is not available, then it can escalate to that next person. And when we're determining who these people are, we're thinking about various things around how are we going to reach the primary, how are we going to reach the secondary. So the primary is expected to be reasonably available within a couple of minutes. And the secondary is kind of a backup for that, and so the availability is less, but we still want them to be able to get to a computer quickly. So things that need to be considered there is, are you traveling on the tube? Do you have access to the Wi-Fi in the stations? And if you're going between stations, you're going to be dropping in and out of that connectivity. When you're out of the tube station, or if you're walking around and walking back home, what kind of connectivity are you going to get on your phone? Is it 3G or 4G? Or you downgraded to Edge? And in the evenings or weekends, have you forgotten that you're on call and you've got Do Not Disturb enabled? People are trying to call you, push notifications you're trying to go through, but it's all on silent because your phone is on silent, and perhaps you've also got Do Not Disturb enabled. If you're at the gym, or swimming, or cycling, or some other event where your phone is not right next to you, is it in a locker, is it in your bag? What happens if suddenly in the evening there's a family emergency? Do you need to suddenly go out to a doctor, or dentist, or hospital? And also, something people forget is Apple released a great new update, everyone downloads it, and your phone is bricked for a couple of hours. What happens then? If you're on call, or if you're traveling, or anything like that, then just wait a couple of days, wait until you get back to your Wi-Fi, with your 150 meg cable connection at home, and you can download that update, and you can respond to on-call. And on-call also means off-call. So we rotate the primary and the secondary on a weekly basis. Different members of the team will take it, so you're not always on call. But if you do get woken up in the middle of the night on Tuesday, you don't want to have to be woken up again on Wednesday and Thursday, Friday, and so on throughout the week. So if you do get called and you're woken up or disrupt something, then the next 24 hours we allow that person to be off call and someone else takes over. If there's not anyone available in the team, then perhaps we just switch the primary and secondary. Or wherever possible, we allow people to have off-call time. And those rotations are really important. We do that once a week. On a Tuesday at midday, we do an on-call handoff to whoever the next person is. Whoever is doing that through PagerDuty, which we use through a couple of other products as well. PagerDuty sends you a notification when you're going to be coming on call so you don't forget, but we do a handoff. You want to make sure that you're not on call again and again and again. When you have a small team, this can be difficult to do. There's just a couple of you. But once your team starts growing larger, then it's easier to rotate between people. Because it's not fair to have your life disrupted, to be able to access the internet or accessibility and reachability every day of the week. You also have to prepare for illness, because it's not really something you can easily predict. People get ill. If they're on call, you really don't want to be woken up in the middle of the night. And the same thing applies to what happens the next day. If you're in a small team and you're woken up for a couple of hours in the middle of the night, can you get back to sleep? Because it's light and it's in the summer, and it's really difficult to get back to sleep at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. as the sun's coming up. And you've then got to go into work the next day, and you might be expected to be productive. So can you come in late, or can you take the day off, depending on your team size and depending on what the outage was you have to deal with. These are all kind of human factors that you have to take into consideration. It's not just the alert that is responded to. You have to understand what the impact is on that, and whether it's impact on projects that might need to be put back a couple of days, or releases that are put back just because people are tired and fatigued. So the next step is the documentation. And the key part of this is that documentation should be searchable. If there's just a couple of you and it's a very small team, then the likelihood is that everyone's going to know everything about the project. But as your team grows, you have more people switching on call and off call, you have more components managed by different teams, then not everyone is going to know every single piece of what's going on within that infrastructure. You might get an alert and you don't know what the error message is. So the key thing here is being able to easily search for that error message, find the documentation that explains what you should do, what the symptoms are of a particular problem, what the error message means. And the documentation needs to be easy to edit. Everyone hates updated documentation. It's the worst thing, and wikis sound great, but they often get outdated very, very quickly. So having documentation that is easy to edit is very important here as well. And the best kind of documentation is code. We use Puppet to manage our infrastructure. You could be using Chef or some other tool, but the key thing there is that the code is the documentation for a lot of the deployment process, the configuration, and what is installed. But there are going to be things and procedures, alert text you want to search for that just can't be in code. And this is also important to have the documentation completely separate from your infrastructure, because if your data center goes down and it's hosted on an internal wiki, you can't access it. And again, up to date. And that kind of links into it being easy to edit. The worst thing is if you're woken up in the middle of the morning and you go search for an error message and it tells you how to fix it, but actually it doesn't fix it because the documentation is out of date. I looked at a couple of different tools earlier in the year, and we decided to use Google Docs for this. It's easy to share within the team. The search functionality, as you expect, is very good. And so we document all the different services, the error messages, our incident checklists are all within Google. And despite the slide I showed earlier, Google is actually quite reliable when it comes to...
Sorry, I have a question. I use Google Drive all the time when we put some documents in it, and we find Drive, the search functionality can be horrible. So I find it completely unusable. Does it actually work for you?
Yes. So you're my Mary on that. Wikis are fine, GitHub text files are fine, the search is a lot better on GitHub than it used to be. we found Google Docs is very good for that. And so, as I said, we tried a couple of different tools earlier in the year. If you go to blog.serverdensity.com and just search for documentation, then there's a write-up of all the different tools that we chose. And some people tweeted what they're using as well. So this isn't the solution, it's our solution. And then the next part of the preparation is the key information. Having a list of your team contacts, again, up to date, is important. So if you can't fix a problem, but you know someone who can, ideally you don't have to phone them, but in that emergency situation, then you have the latest contact information to be able to give them a call and find out an answer to your question. And over the last 5-6 years I've been doing this, we've only ever had to do this once or twice. So it really is a last resort, but having that contact information, at the very least for whoever's on call and is supporting you, and this needs to be kept up to date. And also key vendor contacts. So if you have support contracts, you don't want that information buried in some legal folder somewhere. You want the SLA that you've got, the number you should call, how you should submit tickets for priority. In many cases, you have to submit a support ticket and then give them a call. You need to know what the procedure is for each of the vendors that you might pay for support. And also credentials to those key systems. Making sure that your multi-factor authentication, which I assume everyone is using, is actually working. And you've got passwords for all the key systems. It might be a shared password across the whole team. Make sure that works for whatever it is you've got to log into. Ideally, you've got your own login user account for the different systems. And ideally using some kind of password manager for these. Also worth considering is unexpected failures. If you're hosted on AWS and you use HipChat or Slack, then that's a single point of failure because they're also on AWS. And if you're using those for your internal team communications, AWS has a failure, you might find that the tool that you use for communication is also down. Ideally, you can rely on these. These are big companies, they've got enough money to be able to deploy properly, but they do have outages. So you can use these, but have a backup available. So that's Google Talk, Skype chat, something along those lines. So if it does go down, you're not scrambling to try and contact your teammates. Network connectivity is also worth considering, and that's in terms of your home internet connection. So if you were in the Washington, D.C. area over Hurricane Sandy or New York, you may have found that your internet provider was down. And if you're on call and your data center is down in the same city, then how are you going to access the internet? The same as if you're in London and your data center is in London. I'm not sure there's ever actually a case where that's happened, but these are all unexpected failures. And access to those technical support contracts. I remember 6-7 years ago when Rackspace had a data center outage, their phone system crashed because of the number of people who were calling in. So know how you can reach your key contacts through their support system, through email, or not at all, as the case may be. Okay, so you have prepared and you're getting that alert. So now what happens? Well, the first thing that our team does is load up our checklist. This is our incident response checklist. And this is, again, in Google Docs. It can be wherever you want it to be. But it's a checklist that everyone goes through. We have some key steps. As soon as you get an alert, the first thing you do is load up this checklist. We use Jira for incident tracking and bug tracking. Doesn't matter what tool you use, but this is logged immediately. We link it to the PagerDuty incident, a basic description of what's going on. And this gives us a unique ID to track the event. This is before anything else happens. As soon as the person responds, this gets logged into Jira. The next thing that happens is that the responder will log into our ops war room. And we use HipChat for that. And this is a dedicated channel in HipChat where we only ever discuss ongoing incidents. And we use what's called the sterile cockpit rule in this, which is a rule taken from aviation, where during critical parts of any flight, the only communication within the cockpit is critical information. And this stops people from sharing links, posting YouTube videos, anything that is non-essential to whatever is happening. It may be happening in other rooms, but you can exit those rooms, and responders are focused purely in this war room. The only discussion that happens is something relevant to the incident. And then once we're all in place, we've got the incident being tracked. If it is a service-affecting incident, then we post it to our public status page. And this is a key part of the communications process, because if you've got a lot of users, then the likelihood is they're going to start noticing very, very quickly, particularly if your system is critical to their daily work. So like GitHub, HipChat, when there's a down, you notice immediately. The first thing people do is generally go on Twitter, but then after that they will go to your status page and have a look to see what is actually going on.
So a quick question to that. Are you doing this automatically in the Jira and the also?
No, we're not doing it automatically. Doing that is a good idea, so long as you can get all the alerts to post to a single incident that are related. What you don't want to do is having an automated system suddenly creating hundreds of incidents within Jira just because you've got a lot of cascading alerts. So at the moment we do this manually, and we link in the key event that triggered on page duty, and then later when we're doing the postmortem we'll link all the events together. And then once we've posted on the public status page, if it's an incident that's affecting our customers, we'll do, starting through the initial investigation, to find out exactly what's going on. So we have a couple of key principles that we can train our team in how they should deal with these incidents. The first thing is to log absolutely everything. This is using the ops war room. We have a chat, we get timestamps, and we can go through the history later and see what's going on. But any command that is executed, any ticket that is submitted, absolutely any action that is taken is logged just as a comment on that Jira ticket. This is useful for a couple of reasons. The first is if it's a long-running incident and you have to bring in additional team members, you don't have to be telling them what's going on. They can just quickly go to the Jira ticket, see exactly what the history of the event is, who's done what, and when. If you've got multiple responders and you want to distribute different tasks out to them, then being able to know who's run what and when is really easy to do just by refreshing the page. And then also, this is useful after the incident, when you're doing your postmortem. The postmortem is key to understand the timeline of the event, what happened, so you can tell people, but also so you can understand what people were doing and how you can improve your response. Whether a mistake was made in a command, which made the incident worse, whether there was a bit of delay somewhere, or where people did things correctly, so you can point it out. This is something that most people do incorrectly, and you don't post enough to the public status page. Even if you're posting, we don't know anything else yet, then this is still reassuring to customers. Because the worst thing you can see is we're down and then there's nothing for 2 hours. Because as a customer, you don't know whether they've gone to sleep or they don't know what's going on and they're trying to figure out how to undelete everything. You have no idea what's going on. And so we generally post an update every 30 minutes. Can be more often as soon as we get more information, but this just keeps people up to date with what we're doing, whether it's a vendor issue or what we're investigating. And something you might forget is to gather the team around. We've got that primary, we've got the secondary, but it's always going to be one person initially who's responding to an event. And in many cases they'll be able to solve it themselves and it's not a major issue, but in some cases you'll need support. Whether that's from your secondary, who you want to get on just to help you respond to support tickets or update the status page, or all of your instances are suddenly shut down and you need help recovering them. Just getting extra people involved really helps. Whether that's just one extra person or extra members of your team. Even management can come in and help if it's a massive outage, just to be there to provide support and respond to customers. Getting other people involved really helps to reduce the stress levels because you know you're not in there on your own. And also escalate these issues. Don't try and fix things yourself if you don't know what you're doing. Get someone else on your team involved or escalate it to the vendor, whether that's submitting tickets, if for nothing else, because SLA credits start counting as soon as you submit a ticket. So after the incident is finished, then the next step is the postmortem. And your goal for this should be to do it within a couple of days of the incident closing. And this is where the logging in Jira and the chat timestamps really come in. You want to build a picture of exactly what happened and when, who did what, and how things were addressed. So you can learn internally. You don't necessarily have to release this publicly, but many companies do. If you look at AWS's postmortems, they're incredibly detailed, and you can see exactly what happened and when. And provide technical detail. If you're running a consumer service, most of your customers might not care, But if you're running something for developers, or even for consumer services, and people who are paying attention might want to understand, then go into the technical detail. Because the worst thing you can do is say, we had an outage, sorry for any inconvenience caused, because that doesn't say anything. If you go into a technical detail, people can empathize with you. And you can understand you had these major issues to deal with. It's very rare that it's just a single problem, unless you design your system incredibly badly. It's very unlikely just to be a single cause to an outage. There's going to be a lot of different cascading problems, software bugs, deploys, vendor problems, stuff that you didn't think of. And then explain to people what actually failed and why, so that they can understand exactly what went wrong and why that happened. And key to all of this is how are you going to fix it? Because it's all very well writing up an incident if it happens again the next day and then the next day. What people want to know is how you're actually going to resolve these problems. Whether it's something you're already working on and you just haven't deployed yet, or you can fix immediately, or maybe it'll take a couple of months because you've got to do a major change to some systems. These people understand what you need to do and how this problem is not going to happen again in the future. And then you can ultimately get to this stage where people actually say, thanks for the postmortem, it was a great incident report. It's just one example, and one of our customers, and if you go to the URL at the bottom, then you can see what I wrote in that postmortem. But great examples are AWS postmortems, Heroku postmortems, GitHub as well, very good at this. It actually makes a difference to the community, and in particular when your community is developers, sysadmins, or other technical people. So in summary, there's preparation, which involves the documentation, and those kind of key steps. So you're not panicking, it's not chaos when something does go wrong. The key thing is it will go wrong. Something will happen, something that maybe you control, you knew was going to likely failure, maybe you had no control over it because it's an issue at the data center. And communication with your customers and internally is really important. Often we'll be in the HIP chat room, in the ops war room, but if it's an issue where we need to coordinate several people, then we can get onto a Skype chat or Google Hangout or any kind of voice call so we can actually talk to people, because typing can be slow, particularly when you're trying to explain what's going on. Obviously, the downside of that is then you don't have a record as you're recording the call, perhaps. And then checklists. We have a checklist for that initial incident response. We have a checklist for the recovery procedure. So as soon as we've decided everything's fixed, we'll run through this and make sure everything is really fixed. A checklist for any kind of issue that you might understand. And this is key because if you're responding to things in the middle of the morning, like 3 a.m., 4 a.m., you're not going to be at your best. You're going to forget things. There might be complicated procedures you need to go through. Having a checklist really takes out a lot of the really low-level thinking. You can concentrate on solving the problem because you know you've not missed anything. And then the post-mortem, you've got to follow it up. You've got to tell your customers what happened and what you're going to do to solve it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Charlie from Yelp. That's a really good talk. That's fantastic. I really like the idea that you talk about gathering the team. One thing we do in our team is that we immediately after one person takes the incident as their responsibility, they take someone as the communicator. That person gives the communication to the company, to the customer, and also documents. I think that's very worthwhile. We found that a great help.
I think the Heroku guys have a really good concept of incident commander. So it's one person who's leading the incident. They obviously have a much larger team than we do, so they have the resources to do this. But they have the incident commander. You can hand over to a different incident commander when there's multi-day outages, as they've had in the past, and someone who's actually in charge of coordinating.
That leads on to a question of mine about how do you hand over, if you give people the day off the next day and they've dealt with a major incident, how do you hand over and get that tribal knowledge from what fucked up at 4 in the morning to what's going to happen again the next 4 in the morning? How do you guys deal with that?
Yeah. So I think the day off after the event will probably be something where they still come in just to hand off the incident. It's not necessarily that they're completely unavailable. It's just that they're not doing dev work or their normal day-to-day job. just because of the fatigue, and so handing off the incident.
And they help with the postmortem and the initial documentation. Okay,
Yes,
good.
yeah, and the postmortem doesn't have to happen immediately the next day, because you've got everything logged anyway. It can happen a couple of days later. In many cases, Google, AWS, all of those, they don't actually release their postmortem until a couple of days afterwards, because you've had time to gather the team and rest and all those kind of things.
Sure. And just one last question. Do you recommend a password manager that is good for Teams?
No. Yeah, I think the problem there is if you only have a single account people can log into, and that's the case with several services. But I think the majority do have multi-user access, so it's just an individual, so they can use their own login credentials and their own password manager, because when they leave or move to something else, then you just delete their user.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just want to mention outage that kind of nicely automates all the responses with on-call escalating to making the tickets and launch the event, etc.
Yep.
We're using it.
Yep, Opsgenie, I know of them. PagerDuty, I think was the original, released the original SaaS version, but Opsgenie, yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
How would you change the strategy
I think still providing updates to people. There is status page useful. I think more likely they're going to be complaining on Twitter. We use statuspage.io and it allows us to link and post automatically to Twitter. I think a lot of people will search on Twitter first, people complaining about things. And if you can be that top post, just because people are retweeting it or whatever, then that's better. So Twitter is probably better for consumer-facing assets.
Would you adjust how much detail would you go into?
I think it's difficult to know. I think it depends on your audience. If your audience is young children, then they're probably not going to know what you're talking about. So really, it depends on who it is you're targeting and to look at it, really. Yeah.
Do you want to trend your outages?
Sorry, say that again?
Do you want to trend your outages?
Trend our outages. What does that mean?
When you can go on Twitter and you're
Oh,
down.
okay. Yeah, I think that would happen with larger services. I think you know if Google is down, everyone's tweeting about it.
Okay.
But you wouldn't promote your own tweets.
Exactly.
No, I think people don't like promoted tweets anyway.